Just as a warning before the video begins, this video is going to contain heavy spoilers for basically everything in the Kingdom Hearts series, including Union Cross. So if you do not want to get spoiled for any story, I suggest you stop watching now. Also, I need to explain what Nording is. It's a term that is well known within the Kingdom Hearts fan base, but may not be familiar to those who are new or watching this video. And again, spoilers for the series. Nording is a term that the fan base has coined for when a character is possessed by Master Xehanort, the main villain of the series, or has a piece of his heart inside of him. So that is the process of being Norded, is getting Xehanort's heart inside of you.
That's nuts!
So, with that little disclaimer, let's start the video.
Roxas, I'm out of time. Even if I'm not ready, I have to make this choice. You have poured so many memories into me, given me so much, that I feel like I'm about to overflow. Look at me, Roxas. Who do you see? If you see somebody else's face, a boy's face, then that means I'm almost ready. This puppet will have to play her part. Roxas, this is him. It's Sora. You're next, Roxas. I have to make you a part of me too. Don't you see? This is why I was created.
Ever since I first saw this scene back when Days came out, I've had a thought. It's always been in the back of my mind a dreadful, nagging idea that has grown in strength over the years in the games. And that is, Sora would make a terrifying villain. For as much as the games that came out between KH2 and KH3 built up Master Xehanort, the True Organization 13, and the clash between the 7 Lights and the 13 Darknesses, I believe a secondary plot has been building, foreshadowed through gameplay, to prepare us to fight against the primary protagonist of the Kingdom Hearts series. While I mentioned that Shion's Sora face planted this thought, I wasn't aware of it until it sprouted in Dream Drop Distance, when the game presented us with the possibility of Sora getting Norded. Sora Nord was such a terrifyingly awesome concept to me that I was convinced that we were going to get it in KH3 before eventually defeating Master Xehanort, before it was completely dropped at the start of 3. I'm not salty at all. No, you are. Who cares? I care. But it was also here in Dream Drop Distance that I started to see the breadcrumbs left behind in the games leading up to 3D. Every game in KH2 and KH3 includes a boss fight that presents to us, the player, a different idea of Sora fighting against us. And as a game designer, I find the idea of players fighting against the character they've spent years playing a really fun idea to explore. So today we're going to explore how Kingdom Hearts explores the idea of Sora as a villain. The scene and boss that kicks it all off, Shion's 4-stage boss battle, is the example of Sora's power and image being used against us. Throughout the game, we learn that Shion was created as a replica of Roxas in order to copy the Keyblade's powers from Roxas. But when Sora's memories were scattered, Sora's most important memories, the ones of Kairi, found refuge in Shion as her and Roxas were starting to get to know each other. Over time, she begins to absorb more of Sora's memories from Roxas and eventually begins absorbing Roxas's strength. While this appears to not have been Xemnas' planned goal, knowing that Sora's awakening could hinder their plans for Kingdom Hearts, Xemnas works to keep Shion and Roxas in the fold. The gold changes from getting an extra Keyblade to completely taking Sora's power for his own. And it's scary fast how Xion absorbs power and memories by the end of the game. So much so that she doesn't even look, act, or fight like her anymore. Seeing Xion take off her hood to reveal Sora's face, to have her body change to match Sora's body type, to see Sora's face glare menacingly from inside the organization's coat while she absorbs darkness to transform herself into an armored form is just so surreal. It's horrifying to realize how close the organization came to fully absorbing Sora's power through Xion. But there's more. All of Xion's armored forms, the design, her posture, her attacks, even her emblem, all mirror Sora. At each stage, she absorbs Sora's memories of that world, growing stronger with each stage until she becomes a massive Colossus-type enemy that we have to take down. We know Sora is strong, but for his memories to give her this much power is a testament to how strong he actually is. And again, it's scary to think about what it would be like to face Sora at full strength. But even with all of this presented to us, we as the player know that this is still Xion underneath. She may be wearing Sora's face, hiding herself behind a mask. Her fight may represent us facing Sora's strength and image, but we know we're still fighting Xion. But the next game blurs that line, if ever so slightly.
You've done it, Ventus. Now that my body is about to perish, you and I will have to join together.
While Xion invokes the concept of Sora's power and image being used against us, there's more emphasis put on Sora's strength with her. Ventus, however, evokes the concept of fighting Sora's image more strongly than Xion. And Ventus does more than just that. It also presents us an example of fighting Sora's inverse in personality. Ventus revealing his appearance to Ventus accomplishes the same task as Xion revealing herself as Sora to Roxas, the shock of having to fight someone who looks like Sora. But with Ventus, the shock is so much stronger because we've spent multiple storylines becoming more familiar with his personality than his appearance. We know Ventus as this calm, cool, and collected psychopath who takes advantage of the connections between hearts in order to get what he and Master Xehanort want. Essentially a foil to not only Ven, but to Sora. And for this foil's appearance to be identical to Sora's is what makes this shock so much more impactful. Ventus presents to us the idea of fighting Sora's inverse. Fighting Sora if he decided to use all his knowledge about connections against others. Sora knows how much the heart can take, how important friends are to one's strength, and I imagine if he thought about it that way, he'd know how to abuse those connections. These are all things Ventus does, luring Ven to the outside world by casting doubt on his connections with Terra, and forcing Ven to fight against him by threatening Terra and Aqua. For Ventus to have this personality and appearance so starkly different yet horribly familiar is where the line between the idea of fighting Sora and actually fighting Sora begins to blur. It's harder to separate Ventus from Sora than it was for Xion, so Ventus' boss feels like we're fighting an evil Sora. And while both Days and Birth by Sleep present this idea in the form of memorable boss battles, they wrap up a particular character's story, but they're not the final bosses that conclude the story as a whole. But that changes when we get to Recoded.
Wait, how is this possible? It's changing. No, it's evolving.
It's way past time that you learned what real hurt feels like!
G-Coded, why did Nomura give you 2 Sora boss battles? Coded's story final boss presents the example of Sora's darkness being used against us through the battle against Sora's Heartless. As a recap, throughout the game, as Data Sora has been restoring the data in Jiminy's journal by taking out Bug Blocks and Heartless, Sora's Heartless has been absorbing all dark data that was released by the minds of the Heartless slain by Data Sora, in a similar manner to Xion absorbing Sora's memories to increase her strength. What I find the most fascinating about the battle against Sora's Heartless is all the different forms it takes, what each form means for it and Sora's strength, and what each form means in regards to Sora's darkness. The first form Sora's Heartless takes is Darkside. Darkside was the first boss in Kingdom Hearts 1, and to me has always represented the potential of Sora's darkness. The closer you get to light, the greater your shadow becomes. The greater Sora's light gets, the greater his potential for darkness grows, as light begets darkness, and darkness is drawn to light. Even though Darkside is not actually Sora's darkness, Darkside has been an almost constant reminder of how powerful Sora's darkness can be. However, Darkside has always been an easy fight, easy to read, no super powerful attacks. This Darkside does have more attacks. It can use magic, including light magic, and can teleport itself, but still nothing of substantial power. Sora's Heartless taking the form of Anti-Sora is very interesting. Like Ventus and Xion, the image of fighting Sora is once again evoked, but whereas Xion represented power and image, Ventus represented image and inverse, and Darkside represents potential, I think the Anti-Sora form represents the combination of all of them. Essentially, Anti-Sora is the example of what if Sora was consumed by darkness, yet still retained his power and used it against us. Anti-Sora has strong combo moves such as Strike Raid and Zantetsuken, can summon light copies of the Keyblade to rain down upon his enemies, and like in Kingdom Hearts 1, he can split himself into clones. All the copies have the same attacks at nearly the same strength as the real thing, which makes for a truly challenging boss fight. Just as it's hard to separate Ventus from the idea of fighting an evil Sora, it's hard to separate Anti-Sora from the idea of fighting Sora consumed by darkness. And as a tangent, technically this isn't the first or last time the concept of Sora channeling or being consumed by darkness is brought up in gameplay. The Anti-Sora form is based off of the Anti-Sora mini-boss from Kingdom Hearts 1, which we could argue this presents the same concept in boss form, but this is mainly a distraction summoned by Riku. There's Anti-Form in KH2, which is Sora being consumed by darkness while maintaining his strength, but this Sora channeling darkness with Riku in their limit together, and being able to use Shadow Breaker and Dream Drop Distance are harder for me to make an argument for Sora villainy, as they're not really presented in a way that is used against the player. They mainly establish that technically Sora can summon and channel darkness if he wants to. And as a side tangent to the tangent, I would argue Sora being able to use Shadow Breaker is more foreshadowing for what happens to him in 3D, where he's trapped in darkness. Just as Riku's dream forms foreshadowed his Dream Eater status, and Double Flight foreshadowed him escaping the darkness and becoming a master, as Aqua was the most notable master with that combat move, and I just have a lot of thoughts about Dream Drop Distance, okay? I love it. And then finally we have Rage Form, but that's slightly different. It's different from the previous example, so I'm going to cover that a little bit later. Anyways, back to Coded. So for all the potential strength Sora's darkness could have, the final form of Sora's Heartless reminds us how much darkness he actually has. During the Anti-Sora phase, Data Sora can grab a golden Keyblade to revert Sora's Heartless to its original form, a shadow, the weakest of all Heartless. When Sora became a Heartless in Kingdom Hearts 1, this is the form he took because Sora doesn't actually have a lot of darkness inside him, and what little he has isn't all that strong. So despite the potential, the build-up, the bravado even, Sora's Heartless is still just a shadow, easy to take down. So the battle against Sora's Heartless is both a thought experiment and a reminder that Sora has the potential for powerful darkness, but because he keeps his light burning strong, it never gets the chance to become that powerful. As I mentioned, Coded has 2 Sora boss battles, and the second is the game's final boss against Data-Roxas. Unlike the previous boss fights, Data-Roxas does not invoke an image of Sora or uses Sora's strength against us. In fact, we have no idea this is Data-Roxas until the boss music starts and Roxas summons his Keyblades. And we as the player can't really separate Roxas' image from this boss either, so what does Data-Roxas' fight accomplish in the context of this video? Well, let's back up. In Coded's final act, both the data in the journal and Data Sora were reset with the defeat of Sora's Heartless. This caused another world to appear inside the journal, Castle Oblivion, and Data Sora is asked to explore it to uncover the secret behind the message left in the journal at the start of the game.
Hey, we never did figure out that mysterious message.
Waiting for Sora is Data-Roxas, who gives Sora a bunch of cards and tells him to explore some rooms. Quickly, Data Sora learns that once he leaves a room, he forgets everyone he met in there, only left with the knowledge that he has forgotten people. This knowledge begins to weigh on Data Sora. He misses the friends he's forgotten, and hurt has formed in his heart. The hurt, according to Data-Roxas, will eventually create a hole in his heart that will grow until Data Sora is eventually consumed by darkness. And so Sora has the choice of either giving up the hurt and knowledge that he has friends he needs to remember, or keeping the hurt inside in the hopes of regaining those memories, even though it may drag him into the abyss. Data Sora's decision, of course, is to keep the hurt, which enrages Data-Roxas, who says,
"It's way past time that you learned what real hurt feels like!"
Okay, so let's back up one more time to focus on Data-Roxas throughout all this. From the beginning, Data-Roxas has been giving Data Sora choices. The choice to not follow the journal, the choice to use the knowledge that he'd forget people against the illusions in the room, the choice to accept the hurt, or the choice to give it up. And with every choice Data Sora makes, Data-Roxas makes it harder and harder for Data Sora to make the right choice. Like how Vanitas taunted Ven in Birth by Sleep, Data-Roxas throws little jabs at how Sora doesn't remember anything. He insults Sora's character and strength of heart, makes poignant comments about how knowing you've forgotten someone will gnaw at you forever, and forces a choice upon Data Sora. It's all a way of hurting him. Data-Roxas is one of Naminé's messengers. He's meant to see if Sora is ready to face the hurt inside him. And even though Data Sora has made the decision, Roxas needs to make sure that Sora is actually ready and comes at him with all of his strength to show him some real hurt. And that is what Data-Roxas' fight represents, how Sora's pain can be used against us. Data-Roxas does have the real Roxas' memories, including the painful ones. Losing Xion, losing Axel, losing himself. And he throws it at Data Sora for one final test. But this isn't just Roxas' pain, it's Sora's. It's Sora's because Roxas is Sora's nobody, because Sora is the reason he and Xion faded away, and because Sora feels that Roxas should be his own person. Roxas' memories will be the first instance of hurt the real Sora will feel, and so Data-Roxas has to be the first instance of real hurt Data Sora has to face. Data Sora even says that it feels like it's his own pain because Sora and Roxas share a heart. Data-Roxas is Sora's pain used against us, and even then it isn't even the full scope of what he can do. Imagine if Sora actually used this hurt like Data-Roxas suggested. Using this knowledge of connections, people, and hurt against others would make Sora quite a terrifying villain.
This abyss. Am I in Sora's dream? What?
So despite all that prep work, Master Xehanort still manages to manipulate Sora into facing the hurt inside him in an unsafe environment.
I'll make sure I pass this on to Sora. You know, the one in the outside world.
Thanks for the heads up there, Michael. At the end of Sora's story, he's worn down to nothing. his heart falls to darkness and his body is prepared to become Xehanort's final vessel. This is where the Sora Nort theory originates, because Sora was dangerously close to getting Norted and becoming an antagonist. And while Xehanort failed in making Sora his vessel, we still have one final boss to face, and it's Sora himself. But Nicole, I hear you saying, we're not fighting Sora here, we're fighting Ven's armor. And to that I say,
Objection!
this is a boss fight against Sora. While Ven did clad Sora in his armor to protect Sora from being consumed by darkness and the bosses called the Armored Ventus Nightmare, I would still argue that this is a boss fight against Sora. Let's use Lingering Will as a counterpoint. Lingering Will is the thoughts of terror that were left behind when Xehanort possessed Terra as he summoned his armor. Because these thoughts are so strong, it gives life to the armor and waits for the day to face Xehanort once more. We can definitely say Lingering Will is a part of Terra, but as we see in KH3, Terra isn't technically hurt by its destruction. If anything, I imagine those thoughts return to Terra upon its destruction, so therefore the Lingering Will isn't Terra. We could say that Ven's armor is essentially Ven's Lingering Will, with the thought to protect Sora imbued inside it. We could also say that despite it being corrupted by darkness, it still tries to protect Sora by fighting whoever comes near him, which would be Riku in this case. And like Lingering Will, the Armored Ventus Nightmare does have the same fighting style as Ven, who originally had the armor, but as we've just proven, Lingering Will isn't Terra, so the Armored Ventus Nightmare is not Ven. So the Armored Ventus Nightmare isn't Ven, which is obvious, but what makes this a battle against Sora in particular? Well, there are two major differences. One, unlike Lingering Will, there's someone in the armor, and two, Armored Ventus Nightmare is not using Ven's Keyblade, but Sora's. We see the Armored Ventus Nightmare holding a Dark Kingdom key in the beginning cutscene, throughout the battle, and when it's defeated. But when it's defeated and the armor is destroyed, Sora is inside the armor, and Sora is the one holding the Dark Kingdom key. The Armored Ventus Nightmare is using Sora's body, Sora's power, and Sora's Keyblade because the person in the armor is Sora. The Armored Ventus Nightmare fight is a boss fight against Sora. It is a boss fight against Sora in Ven's corrupted armor. In addition, this boss fight presents Riku his final test at overcoming the darkness by freeing his best friend from it. From Kingdom Hearts 1 up to Coded, we've had 12 fights against Riku as Sora. But this is the first and only time that we have to fight Sora as Riku. And if any of you do not think that that's intentional, please tell me why, because what better way for Riku to prove he's free from the darkness than to fight a constant light in his life who has fallen to it? This is a boss fight against Sora. But Nicole, I hear you saying, there's no boss fight against Sora in Kingdom Hearts 3. And to that I say,
shit.
So, Kingdom Hearts 3 does end this pattern of foreshadowing through boss fights. Vanitas doesn't count here because his boss fights in this game aren't really presenting any new examples, or even his old one. He could have represented what Sora would have been like after being Norted, or even a way for Sora to face the darkness inside him, but no, we didn't get any of that. KH3, I love you, but we could have had a little bit more Sora angst. As if, all of this wasn't enough. So neither KH3 or Remind have a Sora boss battle, and doesn't present any of ideas of some part of Sora being used against us. So I have to shift away from boss fights and focus on some interesting use of gameplay mechanics available to the player and story. What is seen in Kingdom Hearts 3 and Remind is Sora's desperation, and how he uses his power in that desperation against his enemies. Desperation, sadly, is not a new emotion for Sora. He's been desperate enough to sacrifice himself for Kairi multiple times, begging to be led into the realm of darkness, creating a hole in space and time by resurrecting his friends. I will never get over that one. There's an actual journal entry for this. And the most desperate of all, trying to work a computer. But KH3, particularly towards the end of Remind, puts Sora's desperation into focus. Right before the Guardians of Light versus the Protonords fight, Sora has nearly succeeded in recompleting Kairi's heart, but is missing 2 pieces. And unfortunately, he's run out of time. His past self has caught up with him in Scala ad Kylum, and Master Xehanort taunts him about his failure. Quick tangent, I love this scene, by the way. I wish we had gotten more scenes of Sora and Master Xehanort interacting in this way, because it's clear that Master Xehanort knows how to push Sora's buttons. Sora's line here,
Enough! It's only 2! I'm saving Kairi!
is so well delivered, and it brings Sora's desperation into focus. The only other time we hear a similar performance is at the beginning of the game.
It's not darkness! Not if it helps him!
This is Sora so desperate to find any way to save Roxas that he has to justify the idea of using the power of darkness. But this plot point doesn't actually go anywhere. Sora never uses the darkness. We never see him struggle with it, or any other game. And Roxas is returned without Sora having to even face the idea of using the darkness, besides this scene here. But that's not to say that Sora doesn't do anything dark, or at the very least something I consider dark in Kingdom Hearts 3. So before this moment,
It's only 2! I'm saving Kairi!
Sora actually uses his powers to try to change the timeline again, and by extension, get revenge on Xemnas for taking Kairi. You see that? That is Remind Sora possessing his past self to attack Xemnas, take the Recusant Sigil back for Roxas, and prevent Xemnas from taking Kairi. And when Sora and Kairi are both trapped by Xemnas, which mind you is Remind Sora's fault for changing the timeline, Remind Sora abandons his past self and jumps into Roxas's heart, only to return when pre-Remind Sora is freed. What is so significant about this is that this is exactly what Master Xehanort did at the end of Dream Drop Distance. He possessed his younger self while he was reforming in order to bypass Mickey's Stopsa and prevent Riku from taking Sora, only to return to his previous self once Stopsa wore off. It's the exact same action. Hell, Sora even brags to Terranort earlier about being able to time travel. So Sora knows what he's doing is similar, at least, to what Xehanort has done. Of course, there's nothing malicious about Sora possessing his own body and taking refuge in Roxas's heart until his body and past heart are saved. Sora isn't possessing Roxas. And I consider this mainly to be a way to explain how we're able to play as Roxas in this segment of the game, but something feels wrong. It feels like Sora is walking a very fine line. We've seen that hearts can possess each other, and we know how influential Sora's heart and all that it contains can be on others. I wouldn't say it would be a stretch to say that Sora could possess people like Xehanort if he wanted to, and, well... So, in Melody of Memory, Kairi is fighting her memory of Xehanort, and she is about to lose. Right before Memory Nort actually hurts Kairi, Sora intervenes. As for what actually happens here, I personally have 2 interpretations. The first, that this isn't Sora, it's actually Kairi's memory of Sora kicking in to save her, so she ends up taking his form. Which is actually kind of cool, because that would mean that this is still a Kairi versus Master Xehanort battle in the loosest of senses. And 2, Sora sensed that Kairi was in danger and sent his power across realities to protect her, taking over her body to do so. For the sake of this video, we're assuming that the latter is what occurred. And guess what? That's possession. Sora possessed Kairi, and holy shit, that is not okay. That's terrifying. Because it means that Sora is strong enough and knowledgeable enough about the connections between hearts to reach across realities, to not only reach Kairi's heart before she gets hurt, but to take over her body and fight in her stead. Xehanort was barely able to keep control of 13 people who had a piece of his heart, while Sora reached across fucking realities to possess Kairi. Imagine if Xehanort had that kind of power, or any villain in the Kingdom Hearts universe did. How do you stop someone like that? And remember how I brought up that Ventus presented an inverse of Sora by toying with the connections between Ven, Terra, and Aqua? How Bio-Roxas presented Data Sora with the opportunity to use the knowledge that he'd forget people to hurt them? Remember how Master Xehanort commented on how much Sora knows about the connections of the heart? Remember how Sora used actual deductive reasoning to realize he could follow the connection between his and Riku's hearts, and Riku's to Mickey's to recover the last fragments of Kairi's heart? Yeah, Remind and Melody of Memory show us that Sora can and will use the connections between hearts to his advantage, particularly to help Kairi, because Kairi is his light. And when he's separated from his light, he gets desperate and uses that power at his disposal to keep Kairi safe. And none of this is inherently bad, but Sora possessed Kairi to keep her safe, which is beyond anything he's done prior. And this is a cross line for me, because I have to remember that even though Sora is a hero and our main protagonist, that doesn't mean he can't do anything wrong. And if this was done by a villain, this would be horrifying. Am I reading too much into this? Probably, but we're this far along, so let's just keep going. So we have Kingdom Hearts 3 and Melody of Memory showing us the power of Sora's desperation in narrative. But do we have a gameplay example? An example of how Sora uses his power when he's separated from his light? Well, time to talk about Rage Form. So, what is Rage Form and how is it different from Anti-Form? Both are drive forms in which Sora is enveloped in darkness and he exhibits feral behavior, and any ability that doesn't involve attacking or moving is locked until he reverts. There are a few notable differences between the two. Rage Form can be activated manually and is never forced upon the player except for... but we'll get back to that. Where Anti-Form cannot be activated manually and is forced on the player. Anti-Form makes your allies disappear, Rage Form does not. Rage Form heals Sora, Anti-Form does not. And finally, Sora keeps his Keyblade in Rage Form, where he loses it in Anti-Form. And before I continue on at this point, I want to quickly talk about the difference between the forms in KH2 and 3. KH2 forms are Sora borrowing the strength of his friends to become stronger. Literally, his friends are his power, in this case. And KH3 forms are tied to Keyblades. No party members vanish when a drive form is activated in 3, and I see this as Sora finally relying on his own strength to power himself up, maybe channeling his memories through the Keyblade or something. So then Anti-Form is when Sora tries to power up with his friends and gets consumed by darkness instead. Rip Donald and Goofy. And Rage Form is Sora channeling the darkness inside him to power himself up, which is why Rage Form is a choice. Sora retains his Keyblade, Sora is healed, and friends don't disappear. So I guess he did learn something from the March Caprice exam. Good for him. But why is this called Rage Form and not Darkness Form or even another Anti-Form? Well, during the final boss, the game does its only forced instance of Rage Form, when Master Xehanort steals the light from Sora's heart. As we already established, when Sora's light, most commonly Kairi, is threatened, Sora gets desperate. And probably the most common emotion Sora exhibits while desperate is anger. Sora gets mad a lot throughout the series, mainly when it has to do with his friends being hurt. He shows more prominent anger in Chain of Memories when anything regarding Naminé or her memory are threatened. Naminé, of course, was trying to replace Kairi's place in Sora's heart as his light. We see this anger in KH2 when Sora's asking about Kairi to any organization member. After Kairi is killed, we see it like Sora's pretty much wearing his hatred for Xehanort on his sleeve. Sora, despite being a literal ball of sunshine, has a lot of rage within him. So when Sora's light is threatened, be it through low health, Kairi getting hurt, or Xehanort stealing the light from his heart, in his desperation to save that light, he channels his rage in order to call upon the darkness. And in the case of the force instance of rage form, that tells us that if you strip the light from him, all that's left of Sora is rage that he takes out on his enemies. So what does this all mean for Sora going forward? He's trapped in another reality, seemingly all alone. Without the power of waking, no one to use it on to open a portal to his reality, and no friends to rely on, Sora will have to rely on his own strength until someone, Kairi, comes to save him. In the meantime, I imagine he'll try to get stronger, find some new way of getting home. By the end of Melody of Memory, a little over a year has passed and Sora has vanished. We don't know if time passes the same across realities, but if we're assuming that Sora did possess Kairi here, and Sora's appearance hasn't changed, let's say a year has passed as well. While we have no idea what Sora's been doing, other than maybe getting his ass kicked by Yuzora, or kicking Yuzora's ass, who knows, we do know that Sora has used his knowledge of connections and managed to reach through realities to help Kairi. That's quite a power leap already, so it seems he's doing alright so far. But how long can Sora last? Without his light, how long will it be before he gives in to his despair, or his rage? And what will Sora become if he does? I want to make it clear that I believe Sora is absolutely trying to find any way to get home, but it's hard to keep up hope when there isn't a solution in sight, and Sora isn't immune to giving into despair or hopelessness. It's just a matter of time and or consequence. From here, I can only speculate, but here's what I think is going to happen, and how it leads to Sora becoming the villain this series has been foreshadowing him to be. The longer Sora stays in unreality, the weaker his connection between him and his friends get. Sensing Kairi was in danger, Sora reached across realities to protect and possess her, as he was not about to have that. But doing so took a substantial amount of power and rage, as it probably pissed him off that the Nortman just can't leave his girl alone, even in death, therefore increasing the darkness in his heart and expediting the isolation process. From this point on, Sora is relying more heavily on the powers of darkness just to sustain himself, and the Kingdom Key will no longer come to him when he tries to summon it. I imagine Sora is facing unknown enemies if it isn't just constantly Yuzora, so losing the Kingdom Key becomes a big problem, and he has to further rely on the darkness inside him. But at some point even that fails him, and in his desperation he calls to his Keyblade with all his heart, only to summon No Name instead. But wait, Nicole, I hear you say. Xigbar has No Name in KH3's epilogue, so Master Xehanort must have bequeathed it to him. And to that I say...
Objection!
In Xigbar's defeat, he implies that his bequeathing would happen if the organization won, and that he was defeated because he didn't have a Keyblade. So the scene of Sora receiving the Keyblade from Master Xehanort is actually a bequeathing ceremony, as Master Xehanort never passed the power to Xigbar, and Sora was never passed the power from another master. So this moment where they both have their hands on the Keyblade is the moment Xehanort passed the power to Sora and gave him the ability to summon No Name. And just because Xigbar has No Name in the epilogue doesn't mean it's actually his, or that he'll have it for long. Remember how in KH1 we learned that the Kingdom Key is technically Riku's Keyblade? And how once Riku learned it belonged to him, he took it back? It's the same principle. Xigbar's heart is technically worthy to wield a Keyblade since he's Lushu, a Keyblade wielder from the Age of Fairy Tales. And when Old Man Nort was defeated, Xigbar was able to wield it because its true wielder is not aware that he can summon it. I imagine we'll get a scene in the future where Sora takes No Name from Xigbar, as Riku once did to him, which would not only be a great callback to this scene, but also a callback to the moment that Sora takes the Kingdom Key back, as he would not be relying on his friend's power, but his own, which would come in the form of No Name, as that is now his true Keyblade. So Sora has no name and is probably panicking. That Keyblade killed the love and light of his life, and he's most likely horrified by even holding it. But he has to use it to survive, because there's something more powerful probably coming for him now that he's summoned it. Assuming that the secret ending is more than just Riku's dream and is showing us some of the new characters in the story, then that means the Master of Masters is in unreality with Sora. Since No Name was the Master of Masters' Keyblade first, he most likely knows when it's near and will approach Sora. As for what he wants, I think it's the same thing as Sora, to get back to reality. We know that both Sora and the Master of Masters vanished from reality, and we know Sora was banished for breaking the natural order 7 times by reviving his friends. But we don't know why the Master of Masters is there, or what happened after his meeting with young Xehanort. Given the most recent Kingdom Hearts Union Cross update at the time of writing this, we do know that the Master of Masters is trying to get to the point in the future when the Book of Prophecies was written. But if the Master of Masters wrote the book, that would mean that he wrote the book in the future and traveled back in time to the Age of Fairy Tales to set up all the events of Key. This is seemingly all to get the 7 lights, whoever they are, to the future. And while I admit I currently don't know how the foretellers got to the future if these characters from Union Cross used the lifeboats in the past of the real world, I think I do know what happened to one of them. While the foretellers traveled to KH3's epilogue, I think the Master of Masters used it to talk to Xehanort 75 years before Kingdom Hearts 3. If this is what happened, that means that the Master of Masters got sent to unreality after this meeting. And since we know banishment strips you of the power of waking, preventing someone from returning by opening a portal, we know it'll be difficult for both Sora and the Master of Masters to return. So what can Sora and the Master offer each other to get back to reality? Well, if the Master of Masters built the Ark in the past and has spent 75 years in unreality, I imagine he's had enough time to build more lifeboats. But if he's done that, why did he wait until Sora arrived to use it? Most likely because he needed No Name in order to write the Book of Prophecies. We don't know when the book was written, other than that it was written in the future. And we don't know when KH3's epilogue occurs, so I'm going to assume that this scene happens after Sora and the Master meet. Using No Name, the Master writes the book to be used as a waypoint. With that done, the Master needs to go back in time far enough to create the lifeboats and kickstart Key, essentially creating an endless loop for him, which doesn't benefit him whatsoever. So there are 3 possible outs for the Master at this point that I can see. 1, a version of him, most likely a younger version, uses the Ark to go back in time to kickstart Key while his older self returns to reality. 2, he finds a vessel to put a part of his heart into that will return to reality, while the Master goes back to the past. Or 3, a piece of the Master possesses his younger self before going back to the Age of Fairy Tales, while his possessed younger self returns to reality. If it's the first or the third, that means that someone in unreality is his younger self, and the only people younger than him that we know of right now that fit the bill are Riku, Yozora, and Sora. Before we try to whittle down who this might be, we should recap what we know about the Master of Masters. We know that he's very expressive, but has the personality of someone gone mad. Someone who likely spent years desperately trying to do one thing in particular and failing. We know that the Keyblade War started when he was a boy and that he had no master, and that the darkness he was facing was humanoid. He is knowledgeable in many things due to the Book of Prophecies and the Gazing Eye, and has plans to reach a point in the future. To reach that point, he manipulates multiple people into ending the world with contradictory roles, and sets up his return to the future by giving Luxu in particular No Name. This will require a deep understanding of how hearts behave, the connections between hearts and how to manipulate them, knowledge of the rules of time travel, and how to restore a bodiless heart. Finally, we know that he vanished at some point before Key officially started. We know very little about Yozora. The form we see in KH3 isn't his real appearance. His heart was apparently replaced with another's, according to Nameless Star, whom he may be close with. He wandered into unreality, went through some trials, and was told to save Sora. And I think we can safely say Yozora can get desperate, since it seems he's been wandering around in unreality for a while, and he's the most difficult boss in the entire fucking series. But I don't think Yozora is the Master of Masters' younger self due to how little we know about him. Riku definitely has knowledge of time travel, has been involved in a Keyblade war against humanoid opponents, and technically doesn't have a master as he was mainly self-taught. Riku keeps his emotions particularly close to the chest, so we don't often see him desperate, if at all. But we don't know if Riku knows how to restore a bodiless heart, or has a deep knowledge of the connections between hearts as someone else on this list, so Riku doesn't perfectly fit. Sora has knowledge of time travel, has been involved in a Keyblade war against humanoid opponents, technically doesn't have a master as he was mainly self-taught, knows of multiple ways to restore bodiless hearts, has a deep knowledge of the connections between hearts, and is one of the most emotionally expressive protagonists, has been shown in a desperate state multiple times, not just in story, but in gameplay, through rage form and hijacking his own past self, and possessing Kairi. Oh, and he has the ability to wield No Name, the Master of Masters Keyblade. Sora is the only one that fits, which means that Sora is the Master of Masters' younger self. Sora is the Master of Masters. This means that Sora takes No Name and the Book of Prophecies on the lifeboat and travels back in time to create the Ark in the Age of Fairy Tales, which he would know how to do from the Master of Masters, and kickstarts the events of Key. But why would Sora do any of this in the first place? As already mentioned, Sora has expressed desperation on a number of occasions, and the Master of Masters likely desperately tried to do something in particular and was driven mad by his failure. If Sora is the Master of Masters, that means that the Master of Masters is the Sora who spent who knows how long trying to get home, but failing. The Master is the Sora who gave into his despair, went mad, used his knowledge of connections to circumvent his banishment from the world by going back in time and using Lushu's memories, No Name, and the book as a waypoint to recomplete himself. This was all so he can get home, but why would Sora as we know him now go back in time? How would he be okay with all of this? Most likely, the Master manipulates him. Can you manipulate your younger self? By saying that this is the only way to return home. The only way he can see Kairi, Riku, Donald, Goofy, all of his friends again. And because he's in a desperate state to return home, and maybe learning that he's talking with his older self, Sora may feel like this is the only way. Essentially, Sora didn't give himself a choice. So in this scenario, Sora has gone back in time to the Age of Fairy Tales and will eventually become the Master of Masters, who returns to reality in post KH3 to join Lushu and the Foretellers sans Ava. But there's at least one major problem with this line of thinking. Sora dumb. If you watched my Sora character development series, you know that I don't think Sora is actually dumb. Sora has been shown to put together complicated plot points fairly well, even if he doesn't understand the full extent. And even though I'm saying that Sora is the Master of Masters' younger self, who learned how to create the lifeboats already, the Master would be sending Sora back in time and, well...
Stupid computer!
Sora!
Even if the Master of Masters wrote Sora a complete guide on how to build the Ark, I actually have a hard time believing Sora would be able to build everything in time without smashing it to pieces out of frustration, and as a game designer, I feel that. That being said, the Ark in Union Cross isn't finished, so I guess he didn't need to complete it to full specs. So let's explore the other option. The Master of Masters goes back in time to the Age of Fairy Tales, but Norts someone before he leaves and his vessels return to reality. Again, we have three options: Riku, Yozora, and Sora. Riku has already been possessed, has a resistance to darkness and most likely possession, and his redemption story has been done to death at this point. Yozora is definitely a candidate since we know his heart has already been replaced, whatever that means. But he's been given a task to save Sora, which he translates as attacking him. This logic has been seen in Kingdom Hearts before, with Sora trying to save Riku by beating the shit out of him, so that means something happened to Sora that Yozora has to stop. I think you all know where I'm going with this. The Master of Masters possesses Sora before going back in time, and the Sora of Masters, the Master of Sora, the Sora of Soras, returns to reality. But I imagine the Master wants full control over his new vessel, and Sora probably is going to fight back. So that leaves us with our combo option, that the Master of Masters is Sora, which allows him to fully possess Sora before traveling back to the Age of Fairy Tales as the Master, while the possessed Sora returns to reality. And before any of you think the combo option is too out there, we've not only seen Xehanort, but Sora himself possess a past version of themselves. And to bring it all back to gameplay foreshadowing, Remind is technically us, the player, playing as a pre-Remind Sora possessed by a Remind Sora, and of course a very closely possessed Roxas and an actually possessed Kairi and Melody of Memory. This is not out of the realm of possibility for Kingdom Hearts. Also, I'd like to point out that the Sora as a vessel plot point was dropped way too early after being introduced, since Xehanort tried so hard to get Sora's power in 3D by possessing Sora, and in Days and Kingdom Hearts 3 through Xion. And so it seems like Sora's power is important, and I don't think the Sora being a vessel plot point has actually been dropped. So Soranort 2.0 returns to reality to join up with Xigbar and the foretellers Sans Ava, which means that his goal is accomplished and he's returned home. But we also know that the Master of Masters has set up all of this to not only get home, but to stop the endless battle between light and dark. Allegedly. It's hard to say if this is really his goal, as we know the Master allowed darkness to see the book so that it could know to hide itself in Ven. And then we have the 7 new pieces on the board in KH3's epilogue, which are the same color as the 13 Seekers of Darkness's pieces. So I think it's safe to say that they're not on the side of light, no matter what the reason the Master of Soras gives. I can't believe I keep writing Master of Soras. He has still doomed thousands of children, manipulated his pupils into ending the world, and fed Xehanort's darkest tendencies, all so he can return to this point in time. A line has been crossed, and there's no going back from that. And what happens when Sora returns to the Guardians, and they find out everything he's done? Despite how much they missed him, I imagine it'll be hard for a deranged Sora who orchestrated all of their pain and suffering just to get back to this point in time to be accepted back so easily, which may send Sora completely over the edge. I mean, he's done so much just to get back to his friends and they don't accept him. Why? Everything was for them. Why aren't they happy? And this is where I think Sora finally snaps. Mind you, this is a Sora that gave into his despair and went mad, so it'll be easier for him to turn on the same people he tried to return to. Or maybe this is the final straw that opens his heart to be completely consumed by darkness, with a capital D. Either way, Sora is no longer our protagonist, and we're going to have to face him in battle. Everything the games have built up towards would finally come to fruition. A boss fight, or fights, I'm hoping for multiple fights, against the protagonist we've spent years becoming familiar with, being twisted beyond recognition after years of desperation, toying with the emotions and connections between hearts, consumed by the darkness and throwing his pain and rage at us with full power, potentially all with that familiar smile on his face. And that is what makes Sora a terrifying villain. And this doesn't mean Sora can't be saved. He will be. It's just going to take a very strong light. Thank you so much for watching this video. I know I don't normally post theory videos on here. I did do like a small theory video for the Sora character development series, but this is a little bit different. I know the theory part probably got a little bit long and may not connect as well with the whole gameplay foreshadowing that the essay is meant to be, but I do hope that it makes sense at least. And again, I hope you all enjoy it. This is going to be my last Sora related video for a while. I know I technically haven't done the Sora character development in KH3 and Remind, but honestly, I'm still processing KH3 and Remind. I kind of jumped ahead, but if the ending of this video didn't foreshadow anything, then I've failed my job. I'm gonna try to do the Kyrie development series. It's gonna take a bit, starting a new job and all that, but you know, looking forward to doing that. So keep an eye out for that. And again, thank you for watching.